Okay, and I can start?
Yes.
Okay, hello. Hello, can you hear me? Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to our wonderful composers here. I don't think I've ever been surrounded by so many living composers, which is really, really wonderful. And maybe just to start off, so that we have a place to begin, we just go really quickly, and why don't you say your name in the piece being performed here at the festival, or the piece that has been performed already? I guess we can start on this side.
Sure. Good afternoon, I'm Jim Stephenson from Chicago, Illinois, and we're doing my violin concerto tonight. It's a West Coast premiere.
I am Cindy McTee. We live in Detroit, my husband and I, and the title of my piece is Double Play.
I'm Michael Gandolfi, hailing from Boston, Massachusetts, and I've had performed Points of Departure last night, and tomorrow Pinocchio's Adventures in Funland run the family concert.
And I'm Aaron J. Kernis. I live in New York and in California, and my second symphony was performed last night.
I'm Clarice Assad. I am the composer of Ad Infinitum, which was performed last night by Dame Evelyn Glennie, this guy over here.
I'm David T. Little from Weehawken, New Jersey, and we'll hear the world premiere tonight of The Conjured Life.
I'm Gabriella Smith, and I'm from Berkeley, California, and you will hear my piece, Field Guide, next weekend.
Awesome. So I'm going to start with a question, and then, of course, immediately we'll start having a conversation with you, because that's why we're here. So we will take your questions. But I'm just curious about Clarice, since your piece last night was a world premiere, as in it had never been heard before, nor will it actually be heard this way again, right? So I'm just curious, what can you tell us about what it feels like to actually know that your piece is being performed for the first time, and what it feels like to live in the moment with it, then after you hopefully slept last night, you didn't have to, but hopefully slept last night, how does it feel this morning?
Thank you. I was just asked how you feel this morning, right? Have you come down from your high from last night? I was like, I hope I never come down from that high, ever. Never. Because it was really an amazing performance. It was so incredible for me to listen to it. So much of it, I had no idea what it was going to sound like, because they were just markings for, suggestions for improvisation for both Evelyn and Christy and the orchestra. So a lot of it was a surprise for me as well, And as he said, it will never be performed ever the same way again, because of these elements of surprise that are just guidelines for everybody to have a chance to create on the spot. And I think that coming from a jazz background, which is what I'm coming from, it's very important to give everybody the freedom to do whatever they want, as long as there's some structure and it doesn't sound completely crazy. So I'm really happy with the result. Couldn't be happier.
And that's, if I can go further one more step, because, it's such an important balance for one to be able to achieve when they want to write an improvisation, or to open up the door to an improvisation, to an orchestra, where I think you need to find the right balance where there is improvisation, but there is enough guidelines within the improvisation where, your input is still there in the piece. You know what I mean? So do you want to talk about how you created this way? Like, what guidelines did you give the orchestra, and then what was it that we could do with those guidelines? Because I find it fascinating, if you just say, do whatever you want, then it's actually harder for the orchestra to do anything,
of course,
than giving just the right guidelines and then say, open the door,
Yeah, this actually comes from many years of working with the voice and the body to create music, through a workshop that I created called Voxploration. And I just developed a lot of techniques to get anyone who likes to make music to be able to follow them and create music or soundscapes. Let's say people cannot sing, but they can dance or they can do something rhythmic with their bodies, and then I just created sets of ways in which they could do their best, finding the best in each person. That's what these guidelines come from. Like, for example, there was one time I gave a set of pitches that could be in any scale. It happened to be a pentatonic scale, but it could be any scale at all. And all Christy had to do was going from, I don't think that's what the scale, but he could, and following that, the musicians could create melodies. So anybody can follow that. It's very easy and simple, right? That's just one example of the many things that went on last night.
Yeah, it was really fun, I have to say, to be able to do a little scary at first because, oftentimes I try to follow exactly what's on the page, and it's not always that the, a conductor is actually asked to say, this is as much input from you in the performance and coming up with how to perform it as it is just from guidelines. So a very, very different approach. Now on the other two pieces from the program, Michael's Points of Departure and the Second Symphony by Aaron, these were pieces that you had heard before. Yours in a slightly different orchestration, Michael, but how do you want to talk a little bit about what it feels like to have your music premiered? Aaron, we were talking backstage and you were saying that also about the talking, you said you were feeling very nervous about the anticipation of what was coming next. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? How because, composers so often are not on the stage actually performing, but do you have the same every time, even an older piece, every time is it performed, does it feel the same? Does it feel like it's being born once again and once again? How does that feel? Okay, politeness is king here.
So really, every performance feels fresh and new and scary and exciting, and I'm always nervous for the person next to me, whether it's a son, daughter, wife, whatever, friend, because often I'm slowly crushing their hand. And if they're a pianist, as my wife is, it's kind of extra scary. But the truth is that the better the performance, the less hand crushing there is, and the less nervous I am, and the more I can kind of be in the moment and live with the excitement, and which was very much the case last night. I kept on, I don't know how many people were watching me accentuate certain timpani downbeats in my seat and things like that. But of course, the thing I love so much is that the music remains it's completely physicalized. I mean, I remember, it's 20 whatever years ago, and I remember the harmonies, and I remember what's supposed to happen and all that, and it's like it was written yesterday. And it's just thrilling to hear it come and in such a vibrant and such a exciting and rich performance. So it was just great.
Yes, well, Aaron pretty much said everything that I would say, with the exception of the fact that my wife is not a pianist, and she wasn't here, so I didn't have a hand to crush yesterday. I only had my program book. Yeah, it is, as Aaron said. I think he's speaking for all of us as composers. That it's funny, isn't it, the way we remember it. In his case, it was 26 years ago. In my case, 30 years ago. But we remember every note. It's not. We're not with these pieces every day, and it's really curious how that happens. That suddenly the piece comes back to you, and it was a premiere of sorts for me because, as I said to the audience yesterday, this was my first time being here, and so I was nervous about that. And we always, I think it's fair to say, of course, we always want our pieces to go well and to be well received, but we don't have control over certain elements of that. And I was remembering when, in terms of a piece being received, and sometimes what happens to me is that I'll listen with. I think I have these antennae that go out and they're sort of feeling what's going on around me. How are people responding to it? Sometimes it's obvious. I've had situations where some audiences are not too pleasant or friendly, and they'll be ruffling their programs, or whatever, and they're clearly not liking what they're listening to. That's an unpleasant experience, of course. Other times it's the opposite, and people are they're almost like leaning forward and into it. could be the very same piece. In fact, it could be the exact same type of performance. In fact, when Points of Departure was premiered, it was the Orpheus Chamber Orchestra of New York, and they're a conductorless group. They rehearsed for 15 hours, I remember, and absolutely had this piece nailed. And I was so young, I had never had an experience like this before, not even close. And it was a Carnegie Hall premiere. Scared the wits out of me when I was writing the piece. But they had what we call a run-out performance ahead of the premiere. Actually two run-out performances. But the one I'd like to mention briefly is it was in Montclair, New Jersey, in a high school auditorium. I believe it was the night before the premiere, as I remember. It was on a program with 2 Handel oratorios and a Haydn symphony. So you can imagine, here's this sort of oddball piece relative to the rest of the program. And in that setting, the audience was polite, but I could sense that they were just not into it. And I thought I was going to crash and burn on the biggest stage. I remember calling my mother that night and saying, "Ma, this is going to be a disaster." It's like, because I really felt the audience was just not participating in the piece. And after that performance, in those days we had cassette tapes. And I was handed a cassette tape by the orchestra, and they said, "Listen, you've got one more day. Listen to the performance, and tomorrow we have our address in Carnegie Hall. And if you have any last comments, we'll accept them then." I couldn't even listen to it. I went and fell into the deepest depression, fell asleep in my hotel, woke up the next morning and said, "I've got to listen to this thing. I'm going to have to do my work." And when I listened to it, I said, "My God, this sounds great." Like, what was I listening to? I was listening with what I think were somebody else's ears. And that night, and then I went to the dress rehearsal, I really had nothing to say. And it was I would say the same performance in terms of the level of performance. It was only one day later. A different audience, a different setting. And it was a completely different response. And for me, it was like, in fact, I got so knocked out by that. It's the only time, knock on wood, that I've had a writer's block, because I was actually looking at that piece saying, who wrote this thing? So I went from this incredible sort of depressed state to this euphoric state that was, both of which were beyond reason. Last night was, I was recounting that in my mind, but of course I've had gosh knows how many premieres now, and I think I'm much better at being able to just sort of, accept what happens and not be so engaged in how everybody else feels because of that experience. I know that it's very sort of transitory, and I try to just sort of be there. I just look at myself as I'm the audience member. So let me just, this way I think I can enjoy it more. Yes, I still get nervous, but it's not that sort of wild, out of control state.
So, I don't know about you guys, but I think you were both talking about one thing which I find very much for me as well, where remembering music is, it's not so much with the mind, but it is a feeling, in your body. You were talking about the fact that it feels, like you remember like those timpani notes, like you feel them in your body rather than just knowing that you wrote them there. So it's in some way, it's so connected to the breathing and the heart and who we are, that you remember music, which is so wonderful. In the same way that you remember a language, that you speak. You don't have to think about it. It just is
It's
there.
both in the body, it's in the mind.
Yeah.
And so I think all of those levels of both kind of intellectual, physical, and kind of spiritual feeling are enmeshed. And when it comes alive, we can remember the notes, remember the gestures, and where it all came from. And it's all very connected.
Beautiful. Well, can we actually open some questions for all the composers, but you can focus on the 3 we talked about. Yes.
Loved last night. Just loved last night.
Thank you very much. The question was, when I got the paper or the score for Clarice's piece, and then as I was performing it last night, did I have the same impression as what I thought it would be when I saw the score? And the answer is, for me, actually, I looked at the page and I understood it, but I also realized that a lot of what I needed to understand would come from a conversation with Clarice and from hearing the solo part as well. because I could tell that so much of it was open to an improvisation element. So then Clarice had actually a beautiful video where she was explaining a lot of the sounds that she wrote on page. But I don't know if you noticed at the very beginning, the orchestra starts doing this, which she calls bubble sounds. And when I looked at the score, I just assumed that we're all gonna have bubble wrap and pop, bubbles. And I thought this is kind of fun, but then, we're conscious of the environment, so then we didn't do that. We just didn't. Good save, Clarice. So then, so there was a video explaining all of these things, and then when we met before the first rehearsal, then we talked about these things, and during the rehearsal process, I kept asking, is this too much? Am I waiting too long? Does this need to go on longer? And every time Clarice said, sure, do whatever. Right? Which basically meant that then I could do whatever. So it was completely not what I anticipated. I mean, the sections that were written out, I knew what to expect, but the ones that were not, it was all new. And from rehearsal to rehearsal was all new. Yeah. Yes?
I wanted to know about your process of doing something that's a tribute to somebody, and how you went about it, and just that process.
Sure. Well, just so, did everybody hear the question? So my piece tonight is The Conjured Life, which is a tribute to Lou Harrison. And in a way, it's a piece that has been in my DNA since I first encountered Lou's music, which I found incredibly moving immediately, and has since become some of the music that is most precious to me. So part of it was just trying to understand for myself what in my own language, as it's developed over the years, actually comes from Harrison's work, as it has been acquired over the last 15, 20 years, and to try to accentuate those elements in the work, because there aren't any quotations. I mean, it's all my music, but there are things in my music that come from Lou. And so it was about finding those, identifying those, and bringing them sort of to the foreground of the work, which allowed me to write a piece that was still very much me, but acknowledged the debt to Harrison's work.
Can we actually take it one step further? Do you want to talk a little bit about your experiences? It's a similar idea, of giving tribute to someone, Gabriella?
Sure. So my piece, Field Guide, was commissioned in honor of John Adams' 70th birthday. And I studied with him as a teenager and have known him since I was about 16. And that was an interesting process because knowing him, I sort of realized that he wouldn't want a tribute that was about his music. I think being a really great teacher, he hasn't wanted me to do what he does. He's wanted me to find my own voice and really write music that's the most me possible. So that's what I tried to do in this piece, really explore what that meant and try to celebrate that in honor of him. And I think hopefully that's what he would want. He enjoys. I don't know. He hasn't heard it yet, so.
Very cool. Other questions? Yes, please. There's.
Would you talk about the importance and role of collaboration in your work, either with the conductor or with the people that you're writing for, such as Evelyn Glennie?
Okay. Would you like a specific composer to answer, or all of us?
Well, whoever feels they might have something to say about that. I know.
Well, maybe, Jim, do you want to talk about this since he's collaborating with Jennifer on the concerto tonight, or has, so that...
Sure. So my violin concerto tonight is with Jennifer Frauci, who is, if you're coming tonight, you will discover she's a fantastic violinist, and she lives in Boston. And I've known her for 20 years, and I'd heard her playing for a long time, and it was both incredibly... She has a technical gift that's amazing, and musicality at the same time, which is what you, of course, love in all soloists. I might be disappointing you with my answer a little bit because I sent her the music and she basically said, yeah, I can do all this. And she might have changed a couple things here and there, which I was, to further answer your question, I was more than happy to do. I mean, anytime, at least when I'm working with a performer, I want them to feel as comfortable as possible on stage. I don't want to do anything where they feel less than confident for a moment. So if she had come back and said, Jim, I need you to change these measures and a whole movement or whatever, I would have done my best to accommodate, because after all, I'm the one in the audience and she's the one on stage. So it's that sort of thing that I'm after.
I think collaboration is a very, very important way to ensure that your piece, one's piece, is being performed to its fullest potential. You know, so that the performer really feels like they have an input and this was written for them. You know, and the best way to ensure that is to make sure that you communicate about that. I can't imagine at this panel that any of the composer would say, no, this is how my music is performed, and you're going to do it or don't play it. You know, there's actually there's a funny story of Arnold Schoenberg, you know, writing his famous piano concerto, which is impossibly difficult, and a pianist came to him before the performance who was going to perform it. And said, you know, Maestro, I'm so sorry, but it's just, it's so hard. I feel like I need, you know, 6 fingers on my right hand to be able to perform it. And Schoenberg looked at him and said, oh, I can wait. So that's definitely not at this table. But it's a great story, nonetheless. Any other questions?
Thank you. So, 2 little questions. So, James, you said you'd known Jennifer for 20 years, and I assume that it might be different if you've never met her before. So that's my first question. And Clarice, had you ever met Evan before you collaborated with her? So 2 different questions.
Do you want to start?
I will just give a quick answer, and probably speaking for all of us again. There have been a couple of occasions in my life where I did have to write concertos for people I had never met. And I have to say those pieces didn't quite come out the way I would have hoped. Not because of the way they performed them, but because I didn't have any relationship whatsoever with how they sound, even how they talk. Whenever I have a new piece coming up, I try to talk with the person because things will come up in my mind based on even just what they say. And so that's very important to me, to know the person to some level. And then, of course, they're playing. If you can learn the way they play, that's even better, of course.
I've always been a fan of her because I met her work through one of my teachers' work, Michael Doherty. Actually, we went to school at the same time. We were there at the same time having classes with him. Anyway, so I was such a fan, and I think I put it out there in the universe. One day, I got to meet her. And we performed together the same night with the Albany Symphony by chance. She performed a John Tower concerto, and I was performing my scat singing concerto for orchestra and piano and whatever. So she was there, and she liked the piece. And then she asked me, have you ever written for percussion? And that's all that I needed to hear. And then, you know, I immediately, like that night, I took the train late, and I was like this, writing to Alan Primack. Alan, do you have a date at Cabrillo? And then she said, yes, in 3 years. I'll take it. So that's it, you know. I met her one time, and we've been in touch only by email since then.
Actually, there was one question here before Claire, and then.
I was wondering how much of Evelyn's music was written out versus what was improvised. It was really hard to tell. And I can't imagine writing those rhythms down on a piece of paper. On the other hand, Jim's piece is incredibly difficult, but I can imagine those notes all turning up on the page for Jim.
Interesting.
Yeah, well, I know what you mean. A lot of it was improvised, but there were, like, I would say, rhythmic patterns that happen throughout the piece, you know, like the cadenza would start a certain way, and she followed it exactly what was on the page, which is amazing. I mean, I actually wrote a lot of those rhythms that you heard. But what she did is that she took it to the next level. She played it like twice as fast, or that she like turned it around and then made it longer, you know, because then she could have more freedom. But the main idea was definitely there. What I didn't write was what instruments she would play at all. I didn't specify that because I thought, she's a percussionist, she knows better than I do. She can choose her own instruments. So I just specify like bass, middle, high, and kind of like metal. If it was metal, she would know that it was kind of metal instrument, but she chose all the instruments herself.
So you didn't ask for the squeaky toys?
I kind of did. I said, you know, I said, you know, a toy set. And then we emailed about what a toy set meant. And then she said, I'm so excited about the toy set. And she had all these things, so she brought them. I expected, you know, less than that. So it was great that she went all the way in with that idea. But there's this, like, it's written on the score, toy set.
Just to follow up on that idea, Cindy, would you mind, because in Cindy's piece tonight you will hear, and next week as well, you write for the percussion and for the orchestra so precise, but at the same time it feels so improvisatory, or not improvisatory, but the groove falls so well into what you write. Like, how do you write that way for percussion, actually? I've always wondered, like, is this something that you just acquired over the years, or how do you go about finding that groove that way?
Well, it's maybe difficult to answer specifically, but I did come to music through jazz, and I think I carry the spirit of improvisation with me. I have carried it with me throughout my career. I grew up in a small town. There weren't any classically trained musicians in this small town, so my parents sent me to study with a dance hall musician who would give me some sheet music from tunes from the 40s and 50s, you know, melodic lines, some chord symbols. She taught me what the chord symbols meant. And what she told me was, please come back next time for your lesson and play the piece differently, which is exactly the opposite you would get if you were studying Mozart. You would have to play the notes on the page. So when I was in high school playing in the piano for the choir, they would sing Brahms, and I continued to improvise. And I had absolutely no reverence for the masters until much later. So, you know, I grew up with a very physical connection to music through performance. And in fact, when I'm in my studio, I do a lot of moving around, and I really did want to be a percussionist, but my parents didn't think it was a very good idea for a little girl to hit things. So, no, I'm just kidding. But I really would have rather done percussion than almost anything else. And somehow I played bass drum in the marching band a couple of times. That's about as far as it went. So I love percussion. I love the physicality of it. So maybe that figures into how I write. But I've not done too much with improvisation within my classical pieces, so to speak. Although I think it may be something I should do more of, because it certainly worked for this young lady over here so beautifully last night. And anyway, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah.
Hi, I have a kind of a practical question about the creative process and how you balance sort of your activities out in the world as a teacher or professionally, externally versus your internal, more private process of the composition itself, and how do you balance those two worlds?
Who would like to answer?
Well, who balances it? I can't answer.
I was going to say you balance it with difficulty, that's for sure.
So I teach a day a week at Yale and have some incredibly wonderful, brilliant students. And having such great students makes teaching very easy because, actually when I come into the studio, it's all about them. It's not about my internal process at all. It's all about seeing them develop, seeing what excites them, what compels them, and also what frustrates them, and helping them to navigate, hoping that I can help them to navigate some of those twists and turns. And that's also very much a process that is ongoing because, after they're out of school, the communication, the discussion continues, and with those people. So that is, in a way, that's a very separate day. It's a very separate number of hours. And then when I go back to my own work, there's a lovely energy that I get from that kind of collaboration, that kind of mentoring. But actually, the processes are very, very separate.
Yeah, I'm also a teacher. Similar to Aaron, I teach probably a day or two a week at New England Conservatory, and it used to be the case for me that I felt I could solve my students' problems quite well. And then I would come home and I had no idea what to do with my own music. And it was frustrating. I thought, gosh, if I could just take that piece, that little bit that my student had, and brought it home myself, I could write a great piece out of that. And then I realized that after a while, the problem was I needed to be not so possessive of what I had. It took me a while to sort of get to that point. I had to learn how to, because with my students, I wasn't being possessive. It was very easy for me to say, lose that and gain this or whatever. So that was a big lesson learned. But now my attitude is I've come to this conclusion that everything we do in life is storytelling, like we're storytelling right now. We're each telling stories, and you're our audience. There'll be times if we enter into conversation, well, you'll be the storyteller. I mean, I've even come to the point to believe that we need storytelling as much as we need food and water, that it's just part of being human. I think it's unique to being human, actually. And so therefore, I could go off on this, but I won't, but I'd say that storytelling in composition is the same as storytelling in teaching. I mean, I really think the best teachers we have are the best storytellers, or the best teachers we've had. Probably isn't anything they've taught us that we can't find in a book somewhere, but it's something about that human connection that makes us flock to that teacher. And the information somehow gets into us much more deeply than if we're just reading it from a book, even though statistically or factually it's probably the same. So yeah, it's not a conflict now that I view it in that fashion.
David, you seem to have a different...
No, I mean, I also teach one day a week at a conservatory at Manus in New York City as part of the new school, and, just for me, I find, like Aaron was saying, keeping it separate is important. So I have the days that I compose, and then the day that I'm teaching, I don't compose, and I just am focused on the students. And I've also just recently started going to artist colonies to work, which I find really wonderful because I can just sort of work all day and not talk to anybody and sort of vanish into the wilderness and get a lot done. This piece actually tonight was written almost entirely while in residence at the Hermitage in Florida. So that I have found as a recent addition to my creative life to be really valuable.
And I'm just curious, does it take you, like after a day of teaching, let's say, or after a day of interacting with someone else's music, does it take you a long time to get back into, shall we say, your mindset or your zone to be able to come back to your music, or is it an immediate shift? I'm just curious.
If I could just jump in, for me, it's not the fact that teaching was involved. In any activity can interrupt the process for me. I mean, just going out to get a postage stamp could throw me off. So it's true. I call it the noise of the day. I try to work first thing in the morning, or first thing when I rise, whenever that may be, and just to not turn anything on, like no electronics, no teapot, nothing, like nothing that would allow the noise of the day to enter. So And I teach typically a little later in the day, so I can get my work done, and then the noise of the day starts, which includes teaching. It's a little harder, yes, coming back home, but again, it's just having been out in the world, and somehow the interference comes in and it becomes hard, but that's just me. I don't know how the others are.
I would agree with that completely.
I used to find when I first started teaching that it would take me a good solid day to get back. But it's less and less the case. I usually, especially if I'm in the middle of a piece, I've sustained through that day or whatever else the ideas that are going on, and then can go right back in.
I had an interesting experience recently where I retired from teaching after 30 years. And I stopped composing as much. I still compose, but I don't compose as much now for a variety of reasons. But perhaps the most important one, and I didn't discover it until recently, is that I felt in looking back, I felt a mandate to compose because I was a teacher. Of course, I also felt an inner urge to compose. There was all kinds of reasons why one composes, but one of the most important seems to have been that I had students, and that I wanted to be current. I wanted to compose. I wanted to teach myself about composition for them, and it's been revelatory. I now want to go back to teaching, but it's probably not going to happen anytime real soon because I travel so much now. But don't stop teaching. We think in some ways that we've got so much teaching to do. When are we ever going to compose? But in a way, for me, it helped me. It helped me make more music.
Yes.
I have kind of a two-part question that stemmed from what Jim was talking about a little bit earlier. And the first part of that is when you're writing a concerto, how do you balance the needs of the orchestra and what you're wanting to do around orchestration with what you're trying to do in terms of creating something for a soloist and technically challenging? And the second part of that has to do also with how do you know, if, like in the Schoenberg question, if you've actually pushed either the soloist or the orchestra too far? And there are a couple of, I just noticed in at least one of the rehearsals of Cindy's piece, when you, Christy, were pushing the tempo at a certain point, and I had never seen cellists play as fast as they were playing at that point, and I thought, wow. And then you upped the tempo a little bit more than that. And so I was just curious if you would just talk about just limits in terms of technicality as well as balancing it with the needs of the orchestra.
Should I start? Well, I'll confess a little bit. So I used to play in an orchestra for a long time, for about 20 years. And so when I have the opportunity to write for an orchestra, I feel like I'm writing for myself, sitting in there. And I know what it was like to be a trumpet player sitting there counting rests. And so I try to keep everybody a little bit busy, which can be a problem. This can be a problem. So it's something I don't know if I'll ever completely find the answer, but it is something I love. It just feels like a playground. I'm sure everybody feels the same way with the orchestra. We did deal with some balance things this week because of some of the things I put in there, but this orchestra is so fantastic, and Christy is wonderful that we've got them all under control. And as far as pushing them, I don't know, you're a violinist. Is Jennifer pushed enough on this piece, do you think? Or?
No, and for me, as a performer, what I actually love in the rehearsal process is I always try to discover where is too far, and then I take 1 inch back, and that's where I want to be, as a performer. And if you don't know what is too much, then you will never be right next to it, and which is why I push the cello until I can find their breaking point, and then I come back one step, and that's exactly where I want to be. So it's a little bit different, but I think in some ways, this relates to how Jennifer probably thinks of the concerto, and maybe how it was fascinating for me, if I can share this, when we met with Evelyn. Is it okay if I say?
Sure.
Okay. Anyways, but when we worked together, the first thing that you told Evelyn when you saw her said, "Is it too easy? That's the first thing that you asked her, which I found actually quite charming, and at the same time, it was such a beautiful question. And Evelyn said, "No, I think it's just fine." But this is something that I think as performers, also not just the composers, it's always on the back of our mind, finding the balance where it's satisfying on a technical level for the orchestra, but at the same time not losing the audience just because you've created a technical exercise. You know what I mean? And finding the right balance, I think you can all talk about this, to find the right balance to see how are you in that place where you want to be.
I have to say, I was totally blown away and amazed at the first rehearsal, because Christy took my second movement at performance tempo the first time through. And I said, my goodness, that this is going to crash and burn, this is not going to work. No, it worked perfectly, and now I understand what you were doing. You're really pushing them hard so they know where they have to be at the end. And interestingly, they were there already. It was quite remarkable. And the other thing I wanted to say about pushing people and finding a balance between, what's impossible and what's just under impossible. It's all about, for me, working with the players in the orchestra before I make a piece or while I'm making a piece, and trying to get feedback all the way through the process. So if I'm not a string player, and yes, that passage is hard, and especially if all of them have to do it to play the same notes at the same time that fast. But I took it to somebody and I said, will this work on the cello and the violin? And tried to get some feedback before I put it into, before the premiere.
There's a microphone.
Last night before the concert, you gave a speech, and you wonderfully, revealingly said that when you were a violin player in the orchestra, you thought, oh, that's not how it should be done. I know how it should be done. And the question of collaboration is, if somebody in your orchestra said that to you, oh no, that's not how it should be done, what would you do?
I'll tell them to become a conductor. No, I think that statement has gotten me more in trouble than anything else I've said. But no, I just never had the nerves, perhaps, to walk to the conductor and to say, you know what, I really don't think that's what the composer meant. And then I said, the only way I can fix that is by becoming a conductor. But hopefully, the character or the attitude that I bring to the rehearsals would actually encourage the musicians in the orchestra to say, you know what, and I always do this. I finish every rehearsal by asking the musicians to give me feedback of what they would like to see different or to do differently. And because this is, at the end of the day, the best performance of anything, it's when the musicians in the orchestra are comfortable enough to play their best, right? And if they are, then I've done my job well. If they're not comfortable to play their best, then who cares what I've done? Yeah. So I actually welcome, and people come to me often, and they ask it actually in a very interesting way. They say, don't you think that this maybe could use more of that? And I say, I know exactly what you mean. Yes, we'll do that. So. Yeah, but it's a good question. Maybe we should ask the musicians. Actually, don't encourage them. But, yeah. Yes, there is a question here in the back.
Hello. I'm interested if any of you were composing as children, and if so, what do you recommend to support a child who's interested in composing, and what helped you?
Excellent question. Who would like to answer?
Well, I started composing when I was about 8, and to me, composing has always just seemed like a natural extension of performing. In my experience, a lot of my friends when I was that age did start writing music and eventually just lost interest. often just because they didn't know that being a composer was a thing that you could do with your life, or they didn't have a good teacher, or they didn't have anyone who encouraged them. So, I mean, I think I sort of became addicted to it because I remember I wrote my first piece and it wasn't what I expected. And so I wrote another piece to try to fix that, and another piece, and another piece, and that's still what I'm doing. And so I think I would just encourage them and let them know that it's a real thing that they can do and that they can keep doing, and it doesn't, it's possible to keep going.
Yeah, I also didn't know that a composer was a thing you could be. I found that out when I was 15 through film music, through watching credits and films and saying, oh, that person, it says they wrote the score. Well, what is that? And then I sort of discovered that, sure enough, there was this composer who wrote all this music. But for me, I started out playing drums and actually playing in a fife and drum corps and marching in thousands of parades, playing colonial and Civil War music. Sort of a strange way to start. But so for me, music was something that you learned and internalized and played from memory, but I couldn't read. So when I realized that composing was a thing you could do and a composer was a thing you could be, I realized I also had to learn how to read music. And so then I got really serious about finding a teacher and just studying obsessively. And then, yeah, similar kind of, writing the next piece to fix the last piece sort of thing.
In middle school and high school, I had some incredibly supportive teachers. Some that were private, some that were part of the school music program. And luckily, at that time, in the area in Pennsylvania that I lived, it was a very strong music program. And so much so that by the time I got into high school, I was it's not that I was cutting classes, but I was always escaping back down to the music department and to shut myself in the practice room or whatever, talk to the teachers. And depending upon one's school situation where you live, I think finding a supportive and a good teacher, not one that's going to rap you on the knuckles very often with a ruler, but really that's very crucial, someone that will help build your skills and challenge you and feed you new information. I think that's really crucial.
And if I can just jump in for 1 second, I think, and this goes both ways, both towards composing and towards conducting. Actually, the best way to become a musician is to have an instrument in your hands, and having an instrument where you have that connection to the music that one will create eventually in the future. It's the easiest way, I would say. I'm not saying it's the only path, but it's the easiest way to develop your sense of what music is and what music can be experienced. So if you have a chance to pick an instrument that you want or that you like, and have a teacher that will help you learn to play the instrument, and then I think easily this is probably the easiest path to be able to go into composition or conducting or anything that doesn't use an instrument eventually, if that makes sense.
I think there is I'll add to that too. I agree with everything I've heard. Maybe just add the element of improvisation, picking up on what Cindy talked about earlier, how she was creative and made to come back with different ways of playing these tunes that she was given. I think it's fair to say that, there are exceptions to all of these things, but it's fair to say that most of us who are composers now in our adult lives started improvising at some point. And I think what Christy said is important too. If you improvise, you could improvise with the voice, of course, but to have an instrument, I think, is helpful. One doesn't have to necessarily be proficient at the instrument, but to have access to one. In my case, I was fortunate, I've mentioned, if those of you who were at the concert yesterday, my older sister, Jody, and I have even an older sister, Connie, both of whom were pianists. So when I came along, there were 2 pianos in the house, and, as a very young child, I just climbed up and would just wail away on the piano, and I've learned to make improvisations without any instruction, when I was about 8 years old, and I had a teacher at 12, and that's when I learned how to read music. But by that point, I I had a very good sense of what it meant to just sit down and make a piece of music. So I would encourage, just from this perspective anyway, I would encourage you to ensure that your child has access to the freedom of just making music and not being restricted by having to recreate something that's on the written page verbatim, let's say. I mean, that's an instrumental activity, that's not a compositional activity. So, and there actually is a difference. I don't know if any of you know Howard Gardner, but he wrote a seminal book in the field that's now in the field of education. It's used quite readily, called The Theory of Multiple Intelligences. And you might want to pick that up because he illuminates how we define intelligence in various areas of the brain that are responsible for what we call intelligence, one of which is instrumental proficiency in music. And it's actually a different part of cognition than the creative side. That's why we have composers who are not particularly good instrumentalists. We have instrumentalists who are not composers, proficient world-class instrumentalists who can't compose. He posits that it's as different as having language and math skills. And we assume that somebody who plays an instrument is going to be a good composer or vice versa. I mean, we don't at this table, but somebody out there might assume that. It's really an improper assumption. So that compositional side, although I agree with Christy, I think to have an instrument is really necessary, I think, just to be able to pound away at something, and even if it's not producing a sort of high-level, refined instrumental result.
Can I add a quick story? So I didn't write my first note till I was 24, but given the age I am now, that was being a kid, right? So I'm a little bit older than that now. But it happened in kind of a beautiful way for me in that I was taking a class called Adventures in Bad Music. And to cut to the chase, the final assignment was to write a bad piece of music. And I'd never written anything in my life. And my training had always been a trumpet player, and I knew what it was like to try to be the best trumpet player, but to be given that freedom to just write a bad piece and not try to write like Mozart right off the bat, I said, I got this, this is no problem. And luckily somebody actually said, oh, that was kind of a cool piece, and that's how I became a composer, because I tried to write a bad piece. And that's what I keep doing to this day, actually. I just keep writing the bad pieces, and hopefully but anyway, it was that freedom, I think, that really helped me.
There's a composer named Michael Colgrass, a wonderful composer, I think he's in his 80s now, who had a very similar start to what Jim just described, although he was a percussionist, and it was a class he had in college, and it was very similar. It was a theory class, as I recall, and his teacher challenged, or he spoke up about some piece of new music. I think he just said something like, well, I could write something like that. He was disparaging about the piece, and the teacher said, well, if you're so smart, why don't you go ahead and do it? And he did, and it was a good piece. And he went from there. It's a pretty impressive story, actually.
Well, we have just a couple more minutes, so if there's anything else. Yes? We need the microphone. But I already like the question.
I'm just curious what brings you all here. I mean, we benefit from this amazing gathering every year. And what brings you back?
It was an invitation by Christy. That's why we're all here, I think.
Yes, that's right.
Amazing invitation, and we're so grateful.
Likewise.
But the word is out about this place. I mean, we all know how amazing the audiences are, and the orchestra and the leadership. It's very clear through all the social media outlets and through our colleagues who are in the music business how special this place is. So this is my first time, and I already knew coming here it was going to be great, and it's been way surpassed. So that's personally why I'm glad being here. Yeah.
I'm here because of you. So, and then I try to bring along whoever I can. If I could bring more, I would, but this is, unfortunately, it is only 2 weeks. So it's not a year-long thing, but we can always work on that.
I have no, that's
sorry.
okay. Is it on?
One last question, yes.
Yeah, I have a question, just looking around, and it's not disparaging at all, but the average age of those of us here and thinking about this being new music, and just feeling the loss, because I'm sure there are people the age of a couple of the people here who are interested in music, who are writing music, and the tickets weren't expensive, maybe because school isn't in session, I don't know, but it just seems a missed opportunity that there aren't a lot of younger people here who are interested and excited about music.
Well, I think that's absolutely right, but I also am a strong believer that nothing that comes easy is really worth getting, to some degree. So I think there is something to be said about the fact that it takes one a long time to start to appreciate what actually is meaningful in life. So I think I have great faith in the fact that those young people that are not here today have just not discovered what greatness really is, but that they will, because this has been something that's been going on for actually, when we look at articles, almost 100 years ago, those audiences were complaining about the same thing, or were noticing the same thing, and somehow it continues to be that. So I have to believe, I have to be optimistic about the fact that if we do our job as performers and we try to make sure that we connect with young people at early on and make sure that they know that this is available, then when they will start to understand the meaning of what this is in one's life, then they will come back. So I'm not discouraged at all. In fact, I feel a sense of hope in the fact that this is still going on, and in the fact that I believe, a tree only becomes majestic in their adulthood. And this is how I see it. But if there are any other ideas, please let us know.
I would like to be a composer. And my mother said, sorry, that's a job only men can do.
Oh, wow. Well, it's a different generation now.
I don't agree. But there are so many theories about why it is that there are fewer women who write music than men, and you've heard many of them. And I have one possible thought that maybe resonates, and that is that composition is an activity of assertion. I as a composer, we as composers have to assert that this note, this particular pitch must be played at this dynamic level over this period of time, at this particular instant, et cetera, et cetera. And maybe it's true that stereotypically, little boys are encouraged to be more assertive than little girls. I think that might be true, but that might be why there are fewer women in the profession, or one of the many, many reasons. But I do think it's getting better. When I was first composing, 1 in 10 of us was a woman. Now I think it might be more like 3 in 10. Right now it's 3 in 7. What is it? I can't.
Well, and Gabby is not here, actually, Gabby Franks. So,
okay, so
our hope was to be actually
almost
perfectly
4 and 4.
equal.
Okay.
So that would have been
but I do think it's moving along. I hope it is. What do you folks think? What do you think, Clarice? What do you think?
Oh my God, it's so much better. And for example, I've always looked up to composers like you and John Tower and Jennifer Higdon, my former teacher Stacy Garup. I mean, I think I gave you a big hug and I said I was a big fan. I came out of nowhere and just did that, and you were like, "Oh my God, who is that?" Sorry, but this is why. It's because having women in this profession, being a woman, is extremely helpful for us. I mean, at least me. Maybe for you too. I don't know how you feel about it, but it just makes it all possible. So thank you.
Sweet. Thank you.
One optimistic thought that I have is that, or one word of hope for the future is, one of my years at Curtis, all of the composition students were female. There were actually no male composers. So, and that obviously couldn't have happened 10, 20 years ago even. So I have hope that it's getting much better.
I'd like to thank you and all the people who participate in this for keeping the open rehearsals. That's how I came to know and love this music. I was working, but I had one day a week off, and when the Cabrillo Festival came, I came and listened. And then if I heard something I absolutely loved, I got a ticket to the concert. And after a while, I realized I loved everything, and I had to go to all of them. But I thank you so much for keeping the open rehearsals and keeping them free, because I think every year I see more people there.
That's one thing that I promise will never go away.
Oh,
so
thank
open
you.
rehearsals. Okay. Well, unfortunately, we have to stop here, but I will be around for a little bit longer. So will this wonderful composer. So if you have any questions as we depart, please feel free to ask them. But thank you all so much for participating. Thank you all the composers.
Thank you.
And we look forward to more.